He could only brace himself and watch helplessly as a second rig spiraled out of control and started heading his way.
Oh my God! What it is, guys? It's your boy BlastphamousHD. You guys have sent me a video with the DMs in the Discord that you have deemed the luckiest people who either survived or did not survive the impossible. Let's do this.
Luck isn't something you can count on, but sometimes it strikes when you need it most. I'm not just talking about finding a dollar or dodging traffic, but 1 in a million events that'll make you say, what are the odds? Stay tuned for some more seriously fortunate people who survived the impossible.
That dude survived playing a guitar, the ukulele.
Vesna Vulovic. On the evening of January 26, 1972, a man named Bruno Honky discovered the wreckage of an airplane on a hillside just outside his village in Czechoslovakia. It seemed impossible that anyone could have survived such destruction until he noticed a shoeless woman in a turquoise flight attendant's uniform hidden among the wreckage. Vesna Vulovic. Little did she know, she had just set a new world record, surviving the highest fall without a parachute. In fact, then 22-year-old Vulovic had fallen 33,330 feet out of the sky, suffering 2 broken legs, 3 broken vertebrae, a fractured pelvis, broken ribs, and a fractured skull. Vulovic had been a flight attendant for just 8 months before the fateful crash, and she was only aboard JAT Flight 367 from Stockholm to Belgrade because she was confused for another attendant named Vesna. Just 46 minutes into the flight, there was an explosion in the baggage compartment which caused the plane to enter a fateful nosedive. When the fuselage broke apart, Vulovic was pinned by a food cart which stopped her being sucked out of the plane. Physicians had advised Vulovic against a career as a flight attendant due to her low blood pressure, but it was that very thing that prevented her heart from bursting on impact with the mountainside. Severe amnesia meant she never remembered anything from the crash, and she even continued to fly right up until her death in 2016.
Oh, shit.
Ava Wisniewska. Paragliding doesn't appeal to everyone, and it probably won't be at the top of your bucket list after hearing this terrifying story. In February 2007, then 35-year-old Iwa Wisniewska was training for the upcoming Paragliding World Championships in Australia when the unthinkable happened. While passing beneath the storm cloud, Wisniewska was suddenly sucked into the violent storm above. At the mercy of Mother Nature herself, Wisniewska was whisked higher and higher into the air at top speeds of 20 meters per second as lightning flashed around her and she was pelted by hailstones the size of tennis balls. Suddenly everything went black as Wisniewska lost consciousness and surrendered herself to the storm. At minus 40-degree temperatures, the vortex, raging at speeds of 50 miles per hour, took the defenseless woman to dizzying heights of 32,634 feet. For some perspective, that's an altitude higher than Mount Everest's peak and near the cruising height of a jumbo jet. After about a half hour, Wisniewska woke up and managed to navigate herself out of the passing storm to a nearby farm, suffering only frostbite to her extremities. In case you were wondering just how lucky that makes her, Australia's most experienced paraglider, Godfrey Wennis, said Wisniewska's survival was like winning the lotto 10 times in a row. Caleb Whitby. The events that caused 27-year-old Caleb Whitby to end up in this death-defying situation sound like something from a Final Destination movie. Whitby was driving up an incline on an icy freeway in Oregon in January 2015 when a collision ahead kick-started a devastating 50-car pileup. Whitby initially swerved to avoid a jackknife truck, but as the thick fog cleared, he realized that the large rig he had been following was now sprawled across the freeway. Despite his best attempts to swerve around it, Whitby hit the back of the rig and was left sat on the roadside and at the mercy of the oncoming traffic. He could only brace himself and watch helplessly as a second rig spiraled out of control and started heading his way. Before he knew it, the ordeal was over and he was surrounded by shattered glass and mangled metal. Crushed between the 2 rigs and his Chevy Silverado, he realized he was unable to move, but was thankful to still be alive. Whitby shouted for help and was rescued by Sergei Karpulak, who drove the second truck in the crash. Miraculously, all he had to show for his brush with death were a few bruises and one killer photo.
Yo, that go viral on Instagram.
Anyone would be lucky to survive being attacked by a grizzly bear, but Todd Orr took good fortune to the next level after he survived 2 attacks on the same day. On September 30th, 2016, Orr was hiking through Madison Valley in rural Montana in search for elk when he stumbled across a grizzly bear and her cubs. Before he could register the danger he was in, the adult grizzly was charging towards him in a flurry of teeth and claws. Despite using bear spray as a deterrent, the animal jumped on top of him, biting his head and arms before wandering off into the woods. Orr struggled to his feet and managed to jog back to his car about 3 miles away. But before he could make his getaway, the bear emerged from behind for round 2. Being an enthusiastic outdoorsman, Orr knew that only one thing might spare him from death: convincing the bear that it had actually killed him. As the weight of the animal came down on top of him again, Orr threw himself face down and used his arms to protect his neck and head, praying for the end. After the bear left, Orr managed to drive himself to the hospital, where he spent several hours in surgery, followed by 6 months of rehab. Heart in a spin. Doctors are constantly surprised by the things humans can survive, but they were truly baffled by this x-ray, which revealed how a man's heart had spun over the right side in his chest without killing him. The bizarre event occurred in 2014, when a 48-year-old Italian man was rushed to the hospital after a brutal motorcycle accident. Doctors at the emergency department made the discovery when they tried to monitor the man's heartbeat and realized it wasn't where it should be. An x-ray and CT scan of his chest revealed that his heart had turned a full 90 degrees to the right in a total anatomical anomaly. What's even more surprising is that, despite suffering punctured lungs, broken ribs, and a ruptured spleen, the man was alert and awake the entire time. At first, it seemed that the collision must have caused his body to twist so violently that it moved his heart. But doctors eventually determined it was due to his other injuries. Wounds to the man's lungs had caused air to leak and build up in his chest, eventually forcing his heart over to the other side. After draining the air, the man's heart rotated back to the left and eventually returned to its original position in 24 hours, making him one seriously lucky guy. Paul Rizzoli. Some people like to tempt fate and then complain when they get more than they bargained for. Naturalist Paul Rizzoli is one of those people. In 2014, he was swallowed by a giant anaconda. On purpose. It goes without saying that this is something you shouldn't try at home, or at all for that matter, and Rizzoli learned the hard way that even a Discovery Channel documentary isn't worth sliding down an 18-foot snake's gullet for. In the TV special titled Eaten Alive, Rizzoli donned a special snake-proof suit, lathered himself in pig's blood, and then acted like a predator to provoke the massive snake into attacking him. Once the anaconda started to engulf him, though, he quickly realized his mistake. As he heard his arms breaking under the immense pressure of the snake's jaw, Rizzoli panicked and called on his team to free him. Thankfully, they were able to separate him from the snake before things got too out of hand, and both parties emerged unscathed. Or should I say scaled? Seriously though, what did he expect? Robert Evans. If you ever feel like you're having a bad day, spare a moment to think about Robert Evans, who suffered a truly unfortunate series of events over the span of just 7 hours. On the evening of September 23, 2009, the 46-year-old homeless man was cycling at the intersection of Folsom Street and Canyon Boulevard in Boulder, Colorado, when he was hit by a car which made a swift getaway from the scene. Thankfully, Evans was taken to Boulder Community Hospital, where he was treated for minor injuries. After being released at 3 a.m. the following morning, Evans began the 4 to 5 mile trek back to a campsite he was using in East Boulder. At around 4:45 a.m., he decided to take a shortcut by crossing a narrow railroad bridge between Pearl Parkway and Valmont Road. Unfortunately, Evans' timing was far from perfect, and he was struck by an empty Burlington Northern Santa Fe coal train, which knocked him and his bike into a creek 10 feet below. After sustaining non-life-threatening injuries to his head and leg, Evans was left feeling incredibly lucky. I just hope he bought a lottery ticket afterwards. Stephen McCormick. It's safe to say New Zealander Steve McCormick can enjoy a newly inflated ego after his lucky escape from death. Back in 2011, this small-town truck driver was standing on the rigging between his truck and a trailer at Waiatahi Contractors when one slip sparked an unbelievable chain of events. After losing his footing, McCormick fell onto a brass valve that was connecting the truck's brakes to the compressed air supply. The valve pierced his left buttock, and within seconds, air rushed into his body at a rate of 100 pounds per square inch. His shell-shocked co-workers watched as McCormick's body inflated to twice its size, turning him into a human Michelin Man.
No.
Obviously, no footage of the event exists, but all I can imagine is the scene was similar to this movie clip.
Oh boy.
As the air continued to pump and McCormick screamed in agony, the men struggled to lift him off the nozzle and managed to place him on his side until paramedics arrived an hour later. The air had separated fat from muscle and filled the space between, including his abdomen and chest, as well as the space around his heart, lungs, and even behind his eyelids. When paramedics tried to insert a needle for a morphine drip, the air pressure only forced it back out. If the valve had hit an artery, he likely would have bled to death, so his backside actually saved his life. In the end, there was only one thing to do: wait for him to deflate naturally via one epic case of flatulence. A hot Israfil. There are some things that humans aren't really built to endure, and having half of your brain blown off is probably one of them. Still, one exceptionally lucky man proved that some people are more robust than we think after he survived such an ordeal at just the age of 14. Back in 1987, Ahad Israfil was working at his local convenience store in Dayton, Ohio when one small mishap turned his entire life upside down.
What'd he do?
Israfil's employer was handling one of the dangerous firearms in the store when he accidentally dropped it, causing it to misfire in the direction of the young store clerk.
Really?
Despite the severity of his injuries, Israfil survived the journey to the hospital and underwent a 5-hour operation. Most of his right hemisphere and one half of his skull had been totally destroyed, causing his scalp to collapse inward after the underlying tissue was removed. When he regained consciousness, doctors were surprised to find that Israfil was already attempting to speak. Eventually, doctors filled the missing portion of Israfil's head with a hard silicone implant. Sadly, in 2019, Israfil passed away aged 47. But he had already exceeded expectations by living a normal life and even graduating from his local university. Forthman Murph. Mississippi lumberjack Forthman Murph had been chopping down trees his whole life, so it's no surprise that he was still doing it in the summer of 1984 at the ripe old age of 74. That is, until one fateful afternoon when Murph's beloved hobby almost killed him. While trimming trees in the Gatman area, a branch fell from 80 feet above and knocked him unconscious into a ditch, while a second broke his left leg and foot. When Murph came back around, he could hear the buzzing of his still running chainsaw, which had started making its way across his neck. Most people would tap out at this point, but not Murph. He managed to stand up and hobble to his truck 150 feet away, stopping periodically to bend down and ensure his windpipe didn't fill with his own blood. Holding his head precariously in place, Murph then drove to a neighbor's house who took him 17 miles to a small-town hospital. From there, he was rushed another 30 miles to a bigger hospital to have his head quite literally reattached. Surprisingly, Murph went on to live to 92 years old, dedicating his last days to his three loves: music, Jesus Christ, and chainsaws. Maybe he should have just laid off that last one though. Number 10. Natalia Pasternak. One summer's afternoon in June 2015, 55-year-old Natalia Pasternak and her 80-year-old friend Valentina Gorodetskaya were walking through the Siberian forest collecting birch saps, unaware that this was a trip they might never have returned from. The pair had unknowingly crossed into the path of a huge brown bear, which made an initial beeline for Valentina's dog, before turning its attention to the mother of two, Natalia. After attempting to separate the wild animal from her friend by hitting it with a stick, Valentina ran to find help, leaving Natalia to face the jaws of death. During the hour-long ordeal, the bear assumed that its now mauled prey was finally dead and began burying Natalia with earth and leaves in order to eat her later. Eventually, police arrived on the scene and noticed that the part-exposed woman was still breathing, and with no other options, they shot the bear and unearthed Natalia, who later fully recovered in hospital. Despite being buried alive and intended as a brown bear's next meal, Natalia Pasternak lived to tell the terrifying tale and even posted an update on her social media with the caption, "Life is beautiful." Number 9.
Oh, I bet.
Phineas Gage. The case of Phineas Gage is quite literally mind-blowing. On September 13th, 1848, then 25-year-old Gage was working as the foreman of a crew preparing a railroad near Cavendish, Vermont, when disaster struck. He was using an iron tamping rod to pack explosive powder into a hole when the powder suddenly detonated, sending the 43-inch long, 1.25-inch diameter rod hurtling upward. The rod penetrated Gage's left cheek, tearing through his brain and exiting through the back of his skull, where it landed 80 feet away. Remarkably, Gage was able to walk to a nearby cart to alert a coworker who rushed him to a doctor, where the physician was astonished to find his patient conscious and able to communicate. Despite losing sight in his left eye, Gage was able to leave his house within a month and could even recount exactly when and how the accident happened. But it wasn't long until those closest to him noticed something wrong. His well-mannered disposition had been replaced by an unheard-of aggression and lack of social decorum, and family and friends claimed he was no longer himself. Studies carried out in 2012 concluded that the injury had destroyed around 11% of white matter in Gage's frontal lobe and 4% of his cerebral cortex, causing irreversible damage to his rational processing. To this day, Gage is remembered as one of the most famous patients in neuroscience. Number 8. Casey Wagner. They say lightning never strikes twice, but one man learned the hard way that famous phrases shouldn't always be taken as fact. In October 2013, 31-year-old Casey Wagner was attending an annual off-road event in St. Joe, Texas called Rednecks with Paychecks when storm clouds began rolling in above. While waiting for a friend to return from the toilet, Wagner sought shelter under a tree. A mistake which would cost him dearly. By the time he noticed electrical sparks splintering off the tree trunk, it was already too late. Casey was suddenly struck by lightning, and before he could hit the ground, a second bolt struck his work boot, sending electricity shooting up through his body. Luckily, a passing nurse rushed to his aid and kept him conscious while they waited for paramedics to arrive at the scene. Astonishingly, after just one night in observation, Casey was released with no major injuries, and doctors claimed he was a living miracle. The chances of being struck by lightning in the US are around 1 in 750,000, so Casey Wagner was incredibly lucky to survive a double strike. One thing is for sure though, he won't be standing under any more trees during bad weather.
Yeah, I hope not.
Number 7. Sambora. In August 2018, one man beat all odds by surviving 4 days in the Cambodian jungle with no food, water, or means of escape. Oh, and did I mention he was wedged between two giant rocks? 28-year-old Sambora had been scouring the Chakri mountain jungle in the northwestern province of Battenberg in search of bad droppings or guano to sell as valuable fertilizer when his torch fell into a small rocky hollow. Bending down to retrieve it, Boris slipped and fell into the narrow crevice between the rocky terrain below, where he became wedged in the rock face for 4 agonizing days.
Hell no.
Eventually, his worried brother discovered him and alerted the authorities, who took this unbelievable photo from above before beginning a painstaking operation to free the man. It took 200 rescuers around 10 hours to cut away the parts of the rock which had trapped him, before he was taken to a provincial hospital to recover. The Cambodian police chief has since declared Chakrai Mountain prohibited for climbing, and despite being dangerously weak shortly after the ordeal, Sambora has thankfully returned to full health, making him one impossibly lucky man. Number 6. Christine McKenzie. Skydiving is a thrill for some, but for many others, the idea of falling through the sky is a total nightmare.
Yeah.
Even when there's a parachute involved.
Yep.
When then 23-year-old Christine McKenzie prepared for her 112th skydive in August 2004, she had no idea that it would be any different from her other successful attempts. As a seasoned skydiver, McKenzie was unfazed as she began her 11,000-foot descent until it was time to prepare for landing and her parachute failed to open. Trying not to panic, she pulled on the cord of her emergency chute, but the lines got tangled and she hurtled towards the ground in a 45-second freefall before smashing into a set of power cables. By absorbing most of the energy from her fall, the power lines had saved Mackenzie's life, and when she was admitted to hospital, she suffered only a broken pelvis. Skydiving instructor Vanna Gulliver was astounded to find her alive and claimed that a reserve parachute malfunction is basically unheard of. Despite her ordeal, Mackenzie even announced from her hospital bed she was determined to jump again. Number 5. Greg Rasmussen. Greg Rasmussen is an animal conservationist who came a little too close for comfort with some of the fiercest predators in the African bush back in 2003. Rasmussen had boarded his single-engine plane over Hawaiian National Park in Zimbabwe in search of endangered rhinos when he lost control during intense winds and crashed into the plains below. After quickly realizing that he'd broken both legs, Rasmussen was able to drag himself to a nearby tree to seek shelter. But his nightmare was far from over. The impact had detuned his radio, so any mayday calls went unheard, and he soon realized he would have to wait it out in the wilderness. Vulnerable and exposed, Rasmussen became an easy and appealing meal for nearby predators, and as vultures began to circle, a stampede of elephants headed towards the wreckage. Thinking fast, Rasmussen beat the aluminum hull of his aircraft with a stick, which scared them off, and he repeated the same trick after identifying the chilling call of a lioness as dusk set in. After surviving the night and fending off a hungry hyena with his drumming, Rasmussen was found and rescued. And after some 100 operations, some use of his legs was restored, and he is now 3 inches shorter. Number 4, Truman Duncan.
Twins.
Becoming known as the Miracle Man is no easy feat, but 40-year-old Truman Duncan definitely deserves such a title after surviving being cut clean in half. In June 2006, Truman was working at Greenbrier Rail Service in Claiborne, Texas, when he fell between a pair of moving railroad freight cars and found himself fighting for his life. After hanging onto the car for 20 seconds, Truman was caught beneath the wheel supporting 20,000 pounds of dead weight, which dragged him along for 50 feet before severing him through the pelvis bone. Miraculously, Truman stayed conscious and even contacted 911 before waiting 45 minutes for paramedics to locate him at the huge rail yard. Blood loss had sent his body into crucial preservation mode, and his vital organs like his heart, lungs, liver, and 1 kidney remained intact. After 23 surgeries over 4 months, Truman, who now uses a wheelchair, was fully active again, and he has even returned to work in the office at the very same rail yard. Number 3. Anna Bagenholm. In 1999, Swedish orthopedic surgeon Anna Bagenholm made medical history when she was shockingly revived after freezing to death some 24 hours earlier. Then 29-year-old Bagenholm had been skiing with colleagues in the Kjolland mountain range in Norway when she lost control during a steep descent and fell onto a frozen stream below. A hole then opened up beneath her body, swallowing her head first and trapping her under 8 inches of ice with no means of escape. And when her friends found her and attempted to pull her out, only her feet and skis were above the ice. After 40 minutes of shallow breathing using a tiny air pocket, Anna's body temperature reached a staggeringly low 13.70 degrees Celsius, and she entered circulatory arrest. By the time rescuers dug her out, she had been under the freezing ice for 80 minutes, and when she was airlifted to hospital, she had undoubtedly been clinically dead for 2 hours. After desperate efforts to rewarm her blood, Anna's heart miraculously restarted 24 hours after her initial fall, and after more than a year, she was able to move again. Doctors believe that the extreme cold slowed her metabolism, causing the brain to require less oxygen, and induced hypothermia is now practiced with critical patients to prolong the window needed to save lives. Number 2. Ron Hunt. It may seem unlikely that the subject of an X-ray like this one could make it out alive, but one incredibly lucky man has lived to tell the tale. On 15th August 2003, construction worker Ron Hunt was working in the Tahoe Donner subdivision in Truckee, California, when one mishap almost cost him his life. Hunt was drilling above his head while standing on a 6-foot ladder when he pushed a little too hard trying to bore a hole, causing the ladder to wobble. Realizing what was about to happen, Hunt followed standard safety procedure by tossing the drill aside, but the power tool didn't fall far enough away, and he landed face first on the 18-inch long, 1.5-inch diameter drill bit. The tool skewered his head by entering his right eye and exiting about 6 inches through the side of his skull, but it miraculously pushed his brain aside, sparing him from brain damage, paralysis, and probable death. Specialists initially planned to cut the drill bit out, but decided to effectively unscrew it free, and Hunt recovered from his injuries in just under a month. Despite losing an eye and suffering a fractured skull, Hunt emerged relatively unscathed, and his cognitive health has proved even more remarkable than the curious case of Phineas Gage. Before I continue, check out this incredible footage captured on helmet cam, which shows the moment motorcyclist Taylor Smith flipped in the air and somehow landed on his feet after being hit by a speeding car on his way home from work. The extraordinary event took place in San Francisco in 2015 when the car emerged from nowhere after running a red light at an intersection and hit Mr. Smith side on. The 2011 Daytona 675 custom bike was destroyed in an instant, but thankfully Smith himself was wearing all the correct protective gear. Smith only suffered minor bruising and was astonished to find himself on his feet, having probably also saved the lives of the pedestrians crossing at the right side of the street. Number 1. Lucky Log Escape. If you've ever seen Final Destination 2, you'll remember this terrifying scene. But your fear of freak logging truck related catastrophes may not be so irrational after seeing this photo. In October 2019, one motorist in Georgia had an incredibly lucky escape after his 2003 Nissan Xterra was impaled by logs from front to back. The unnamed driver was bending down to collect a dropped coffee cup when he rear-ended a logging truck in front, which sent as many as 40 felled trees smashing through the windshield and out the other end. The scene may look like a definite death trap, but thankfully the driver emerged with only minor injuries because his seat was not in an upright position at the time of impact. Firefighters cut through the massive logs before rescuing the man in around 10 to 15 minutes, and the chief officer was astounded to discover that his head had ended up in a hole perfectly sized to protect him from the logs. This person needs to buy a lottery ticket with that sort of luck.
That's real.
Danny Balch. If you're looking for danger, camping out next to an active volcano is one surefire way to find it. Back in 1980, Danny J. Balch and his friend Brian Thomas were camping in a meadow near Mount St. Helens when they were jolted awake at 8:32 a.m. by an intense rumbling sound. When the pair looked out of the tent window, their worst fears were confirmed. An eruption was heading their way. As they dashed for the tree line, Balch was hit by a blast of heat and a shower of ash, mud, and ice that caked him in grit and pushed him flat to the ground. In those few seconds, his entire body went from frozen to baked as the extreme heat melted the skin off his fingers. When he came to, Balch called out for Thomas and managed to wade into the river to soothe his burns. As he resumed his search and began scrambling through fallen trees, he suddenly felt a hand on his left shoulder that took him by surprise. When he looked down, he was shocked to see Thomas under a tangle of tree limbs. Thomas had a broken hip, but Balch was able to pull him up just before the cloud of ash plunged the sky into darkness so that neither man could see just inches in front of them. Miraculously, two other campers in the group, Bruce Nelson and Sue Ruff, who had been toasting marshmallows at the time of the explosion, saw the two men and helped carry Thomas to the ruins of an old cabin where they built a makeshift lean-to. Balch then set off with the others to find rescue, and they were eventually spotted at about 6 p.m. by two helicopters. But he didn't forget about Thomas. Balch used a map to show them where his friend was, and the men were airlifted to the hospital to recover. The worst part is that Balch had wanted to go to the beach that day, but was convinced by Thomas to go camping at the volcano. Never give in to peer pressure, guys.
Never.
Helen Claiborne. The year was 1963, and then 21-year-old Helen Claiborne was on the hunt for adventure. She'd left her hometown of Brooklyn to head for Hong Kong or India, but she had to reach San Francisco first, which meant getting on a flight to Whitehorse, the capital of the Yukon Territory. Claiborne was on a budget, so she decided to fly with an amateur pilot, 41-year-old Ralph Flores, in his single-engine plane instead. What could go wrong? The pair set off on February 4th, 1963, but not long into the journey, Flores ran into a snowstorm and tried to take the plane above the clouds. When he descended, he hoped to follow landmarks or the path of the Alaska Highway to reach Fort St. John, but instead he was met with mountains and trees. Before Claiborne could understand what was going on, the plane crashed into a desolate stretch of wilderness near the Yukon-British Columbia border. The pair miraculously survived. Claiborne suffered a broken left arm and Flores a fractured jaw, but they were now stranded in sub-zero temperatures as low as -42 degrees Celsius.
Damn.
The little food they had on board, a few cans of sardines, tuna, fruit salad, a box of saltine crackers, and some vitamin pills, were rationed within 10 days, forcing them to make soup from melted snow. The pair were able to create a shelter from a piece of tarpaulin and cushions from the plane, while they also fashioned a blanket from the plane's carpet and used gasoline from the fuel tank to light a campfire that would keep them warm at night. Eventually, Flores found a frozen pond and etched an enormous SOS sign with an arrow pointing to their campsite. On day 49 of their ordeal, Charles Hamilton, a pilot flying supplies to a nearby trapper's cabin, spotted the SOS and rescued them. Claiborne passed away in 2018, age 76, but the story of her amazing survival will continue to live on in her 1964 book, Hey, I'm Alive. Man, all this talk of danger is enough to make you grateful for your own safety. How many of you are watching this video from the comfort of your bed right now? Why not give this video a like and subscribe so I know there are thrill seekers out there who love binging this kind of heart-pumping stuff while shoveling down on cheese balls at home. Julianne Kopke. If you have a fear of flying, you might want to cover your ears for this one.
On Christmas Eve, 1971, then 17-year-old Julianne Kopke was flying over the Peruvian rainforest on Lanza Flight 508 with her mother when things took a turn for the worst. The plane flew into a dark, violent storm which shook the entire cabin before all the lights cut out and the aircraft went into a total nosedive. Kopke closed her eyes tightly and covered her ears to drown out the noise of passengers screaming and the deep roar of the engines. But suddenly, it all stopped. The plane had disintegrated about 2 miles above the ground, and she was now in free fall, still strapped to her seat. As the canopy of the jungle spun towards her, Kopke blacked out just before impact. The next day, she awoke in the rainforest and realized she was totally alone. She was the sole survivor of the crash, but her ordeal still wasn't over yet. She had a broken collarbone and some deep cuts on her legs, but Kopke was able to walk until she found a stream to follow. After being alone in the wilderness for 10 days, Kopke found a small path to a hut with a palm roof. Nearby was an outboard motor from a large boat and a liter of gasoline, which she used to treat a maggot-infested wound on her right arm. After spending the night there, Kopke was awoken to the voices of men outside, who initially thought she was a water goddess from local legend. After explaining her ordeal in Spanish, the men treated her wounds and took her back to civilization where she was reunited with her father. Kopke told her amazing story in the 2000 documentary Wings of Hope by director Werner Herzog, who coincidentally had a seat booked on that very flight before canceling last minute.
Danny Pienaar. In 1998, Danny Pienaar was a research student studying the habits of white rhinos in the Pa Beni tributary in South Africa. But this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity almost ended in tragedy. On one Thursday afternoon that January, Pienaar decided to head out on a tracking expedition without telling his campmates where he was going. As he waded through the waters of a small stream, Pienaar saw something long and brown slithering in the nearby reeds. The next thing he knew, Pienaar felt a burning sensation on one side of his leg, just under the knee. After looking down and finding 4 bluish-purple holes and a drop of blood, his worst suspicions were confirmed. He'd just been bitten by a black mamba snake. Black mamba venom is notoriously fast-acting, as it shuts down the nervous system and paralyzes victims, and without antivenom, its fatality rate is 100%. Pienaar knew now that his only chance of survival was to make it back to his car and attempt the long trek back to the main town. Despite tying a tourniquet around his leg, the venom was already taking over his body as tunnel vision set in and his heartbeat sped up. After feverishly making his way back through the wilderness, Pienaar reached his car and drove over 100 miles per hour down the road until he saw another car and forced them to stop. By the time they reached the hospital in Nelspruit, over 2 hours after he was bitten, Pienaar could no longer swallow or speak as paralysis set in. After several days on a ventilator, Pienaar was released with nothing but the bite marks and one awesome story to tell. Poon Lim. When Chinese native Poon Lim took a job as a steward on a British ship named the SS Ben Lomond, which was traveling from Cape Town to Suriname during World War II, he probably never imagined that it'd earn him a world record for the longest time spent adrift at sea. In 1942, a German U-boat came across the SS Ben Lomond 750 miles east of the Amazon, and a pair of torpedoes sank it in 2 minutes flat. It happened so fast that most of the crew on board sunk with the vessel. Of the total 55 crew members, Poon Lim would be the only survivor. As the ship sank, Lim managed to grab a life jacket and jump overboard just before the boilers exploded. After drifting aimlessly for about 2 hours, Lim spotted an 8x8 foot raft and hauled himself onto it. The raft contained some meager survival rations, including tins of dried biscuits, 40 liters of water, a bag of sugar cubes, chocolate, an electric torch, and a handful of flares. But the food didn't last long, and Lim had to improvise by taking the wire from the flashlight and making a fish hook, which he fixed to the end of some hemp rope as a makeshift line. He also fashioned a knife out of the biscuit tin, which he used to kill seabirds, and then used the bird meat to catch sharks. As if that wasn't badass enough, Lim did all this without ever learning how to swim properly. In fact, he tied himself to the raft with rope to make sure he never fell off. Poon Lim spent a grand total of 133 days at sea until 3 Brazilian fishermen spotted his raft on the 5th of April 1943 and rescued him.
He'd lost nearly 20 pounds in weight, but was crucially alive. When Poon Lim was asked what he thought of his world record, he simply said, "I hope no one will have to break it." Imagine going through an ordeal like that and still having a sense of humor about it. Do any of you guys have any crazy survival stories to tell?
Yes.
Maybe a relative or a friend of yours had a run-in with fate that needs to be shared with the world.
With that being said, hope you guys enjoyed the video. Make sure to comment, like, and or subscribe. Twisms.